Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I'm back from Lake Eufaula. We had another good finish. If you've watched the channel on a regular basis, you've probably seen the day 1 recap and the day 3 recap. Unfortunately, I don't have a day 2 recap. The conditions were so rough on the water that the GoPro continued to shut off, and I actually had some damage done to the light port that my YOLO stick fits into, so I was unable to get pretty much any usable GoPro footage. So that's kind of a bummer because I had a pretty good day on day 2. I had 15 pounds. I probably should have had more like 17 to 18 pounds. I lost one that was in the 4-pound range and one that was in the 3-pound range, which is pretty disappointing. But the reality is I had another good tournament, finished 21st overall. We're sitting now in second place for the AOY standings after the first 3 tournaments of the year. We've got 3 to go, so we're in a pretty good position. So I wanted to do a recap of the baits that I used. I know a lot of you guys like to see this. A lot of you like to watch the video recaps and then watch or learn about the actual equipment I was using. So I want to talk about each one because I had very specific choices as to why I was using what I was using in each of the areas that I was fishing. So we'll go over it. Day 1, I fished down south, but not like super far south, but I did fish a pretty good distance from the ramp. And I had one general creek arm that I was able to get a bunch of bites on in practice. And then I had the creek that flew into the back of that, or that came in the back of that actual creek arm, I was able to get some bites out of too. And the back of that creek started to clear up a little bit. So the further I went, the more it would clear up. I was only able to go up at maybe 100 yards or so, maybe a couple of hundred yards, I guess. But I wish I was able to go up further. I get to a point where I'd hit like a rock riffle bar, and I wasn't able to go any further, even though it looked really good above that. But that's okay. So I went to that creek for a couple of reasons. One, it was the area that I spent day 1 of practice in, and I shook off probably about 10 bites. A couple of those felt pretty good, but it was an area that I thought I could go and potentially get away from some of the other boats because I knew the Clearwater areas were getting really pressured during practice. And I didn't feel like I had any specific area I could go to and settle down without potentially getting into a really bad rotation of boats because there was that much boat pressure. And the area that I went to, I never saw another boat in practice. I felt like it would be a good area, even though it was muddy water, where I could kind of settle down, fish throughout the day. I had a short day. I was second flight, so I knew I'd be back early. Plus, the wind really was supposed to kick up, so I knew I was going to have to leave at least an hour. And actually, I left, I think, about an hour and 40 minutes early to get the, I don't know, 15 miles or so back to the ramp because I knew it was going to be really rough. So I knew my day was going to be short, and I wanted to start the tournament off in an area where I felt pretty confident I could catch some fish. Didn't know how big the size was going to be, but I just felt like it would be a good area to go to. So that's where we went. And I started off on a couple of fish that I shook off that were in the creek, not in the creek itself, but in the back of the main creek. And I never got them to bite. I hit those fish 3 times, never got them to bite. So I don't know if they were spawners that moved out of there, but they both were really good feeling fish. So I was pretty disappointed by that. And so then I went from there back up into the creek itself where I shook off a bunch of fish. And back in the creek, my go-to bait was the Core Tackle Hover Rig. This is the 1/8 ounce size. And I paired it up with the Berkeley Max Scent Creature Hog. This is the goat color, so it's black and blue on one side, green pumpkin on the other. One of my favorite colors to be throwing. The key with this is I knew a lot of those fish were spawning fish, and I wanted to give them a slow presentation, and I found that the hover rig works great on spawning fish because of the erratic fall, as well as when you pick up on the line after it hits the bottom, instead of the bait coming up towards you, it actually darts in one direction, which generates a lot of reaction strikes. And I was fishing mud banks, so there was no rock really in that creek. So I knew, if I was throwing a tungsten head on rock, I'd get some sound. But in this case, I wasn't generating any sound. And I just wanted a slow, nice, good fall that would generate those strikes. The Creature Hog did a great job. I think I caught 6 or 7 in that creek on it, including one that was almost 4.5. So that was a really good fish. Most of my weight that day was caught on that. I think I only upgraded once on another bait. I was throwing it. A lot of people have asked me since you were watching the video. I was throwing this 1/8 ounce hover rig on 15-pound 100% Berkeley fluorocarbon on a MHX NMB 874. So it's a 7.3 medium heavy fast action rod. It's a rod that I flip around. It's a flip Texas rigs, jigs with. You know, this is basically a Texas rig at that point, just a light Texas rig. And then I had it paired up here with the Xenon MGX reel by Abu Garcia, which is one of my favorite reels. The whole Xenon series is unbelievable. They are by far, in my opinion, the nicest low-profile baitcast reels that Abu Garcia has made. They're new this year, and I'm absolutely loving them. But this was a workhorse for me, especially on day one. It really was a good one to go with. I did catch one other coalfish that day, and I caught it on the Berkeley, Indiana, Colorado, coleslaw colored 1/2 ounce spinnerbait. And I had it paired up with a Berkeley Champ Swimmer swim bait. This is just a really good bait with these big Indiana blades and the Colorado blades. It's a big thumping spinnerbait, and I was fishing very muddy water. So I wanted something that would really generate a lot of sound and commotion, and just you know, a bright white coleslaw colored bait does really good in that muddy water. I did catch one that was about 2.5 on this. Everything else I weighed was on the hover rig on day one. And I did catch a bunch of shorts that didn't make the video, a bunch of white bass as well. But this was a good bait for fishing around in the creek itself. I fished this on the MHX MB 843 rod blank. So it's a 7-foot medium heavy fast action rod, really good spinnerbait rod. And I've got it paired up with an Abu Garcia Revo MGX reel. This has since been discontinued, but I really like these reels as well. And again, 15-pound Berkeley 100% fluorocarbon. So that was day one. That I ended the day with 14 pounds, 5 ounces, I believe. I was sitting in 51st place, so a decent day, nothing great, but I did think that the weights were going to drop off pretty good going into day two, because I knew a lot of the fish people were catching, and they weren't necessarily sight fishing these fish, but I knew a lot were bed fishing. So I really felt like the weights were going to drop off pretty good on day two, because a lot of the fish that people were catching were not going to replenish. And I kind of banked a lot of that off of my reasoning for my next move. So on day two, I made a long run down south to an area where I had a decent number of bites when I was fishing with Chris Grow, because if you recall, I had I knocked the head of my trolling motor off at the end of day one in practice. So I ended up jumping in the boat with him. He's a roommate, good friend, and we both kind of wanted to go check out this area. So we went down there, played around. We never saw anything over 3 pounds, but we did have like a dozen bites. And based on the number of boats that I saw on day one where I was at, which was kind of down in that region, I decided I would go down there because I thought I had a good shot at catching another 12 to 14 pounds. Which, if the weights dropped off like I expected, that would be enough for me to slide inside the top 50 and get to fish another day. And that's basically what happened. So I got down there. There was a little bit more pressure than I was expecting, but it's a much rockier area. So I started off throwing the hover rig a little bit. I did catch a couple fish on the hover rig to start the day off, but what happened is the wind kicked up so strong that this was just too light to fish. Plus, with it being rock, I really liked throwing the tungsten jig. I've talked about it before. The tungsten makes a really good clicking sound when fishing rock. So I went with this little guy, which is, again, one of my favorites. I talk about it all the time. This is just the Kitech casting jig, the version 2. It's a 1/2 ounce model. This is the black and green pumpkin. And then I paired it up with a 3-inch Berkeley Pit Boss is the trailer. I would switch between colors of trailers. This is the black and blue. I also threw a green pumpkin one. But the reality is I wanted to throw this, and as you can see, I mean, the head of it is worn away. I wanted to throw it on the rocks because with the muddy water, the wind was really making that area, which was already dirty, making it dirtier. And the tungsten head on the rocks was giving the bait a little bit more sound than I would get with the hover rig, which is much more of a stealthy bait. And with it being really windy, the 1/2 ounce bait was easier to flip and feel versus the 1/8 ounce bait. So towards the second half of day 2, I switched over and I ended up catching the bulk of my fish on the jig. I did have my biggest fish that day, which was a 4 1/4. I did catch on a swim jig with a 4.5 inch pearl colored Berkeley the Deal. This is just a chartreuse and white swim jig. So this did play on day 2. I did catch my biggest fish on it. From a rod and reel standpoint, and I'll go over the jig again, I was throwing the swim jig on 15-pound 100% fluorocarbon on an MHX NMB 873.5. So again, that's a 7.3, but it's a 3.5 power fast action rod. It falls right between the 873 and 874 if you're familiar with MHX blanks. Again, this one was an MGX Abu Garcia reel, the discontinued model. I do still love these, still throw a bunch of them, but this played on day 2 and day 3. And then day 3 again was kind of a repeat of day 2. Really strong winds all day long, which made me throw the jig quite a bit. And then in between throwing the jig, if I was covering water, I would throw the spinner bait or I would throw the swim jig. The spinner bait never really played. I caught 1 or 2 shorts each day on it, but the swim jig, it seemed like when I got bit, the quality was a little bit better. So on day 3, again, I would throw the Kitech jig, and the rod and reel setup on this was 15-pound 100% Berkeley fluorocarbon with a MHX. This is an MB 874, HM MB 874, which has been replaced with the NMB 874, but it's a 7.3 medium heavy fast action rod, just a little bit stronger than that 873.5. And this is a Abu Garcia Xenon X. This is the 8.0 to 1. Just a good all around fast speed flipping rod that, you know, is a great reel. But that was my setup. I really kept it pretty simple. I had expected to go there and catch a lot of fish on crankbaits. I had 4 or 5 cranks rigged up, and I just could not get that bite to go. I know some people were catching a few fish on it, but for me, it felt like I really was getting more bites if I slowed down. If I was fishing a bait that I could kind of work slow through the water column, because I think a lot of the fish were spawning fish, and they just weren't as willing to chase as they were to eat a bait that was slowly moving through their area. So that's the setup. I do want to point out a couple other things that were important this week. One, the first thing was really had to do with recognizing where all the fishing pressure was. There were a lot of guys that did really well on the first day of fishing, but their areas were so beaten up that they dropped off dramatically on day 2. We saw a lot of guys who had like 18 pounds the first day, and that they came in with a couple of fish on day 2. So they either didn't manage their fish, or they were in an area that was so pressured, it never replenished. So that was one thing that I recognized in practice, where I really felt like I was not fishing the winning area. I thought the biggest bags would probably come from the dam area, but I also felt like there was so much pressure down there that those fish were going to be split up, and that the other areas I had found, which I thought I would have to myself, and I did pretty much have to myself, you know, I recognized that even though the weights may not be as big, I thought I would be able to hit certain marks that would actually compete well with the better bags that were coming from the lower end of the lake, because of the fact that I would be able to catch that good average weight. And that's what ended up happening. So a lot of times from a tournament perspective, you need to recognize that type of thing. You need to recognize what's going on in practice and make decisions based off that. So I think that was a really good decision. The other thing that was important was the deep dive app. We've talked about this in both the pre-video as well as the post-practice video, where the deep dive app was doing such a good job keeping me up to date on where the water was clearing up. Because a little tiny bit of clear water, like a little clearing water, was all you needed to really generate those strikes. It seemed like you could go into an area that, if it was muddy, but slightly less muddy than the rest of the area, you would get bit in those areas. So I don't know that the fish were necessarily going to that spot, or if it was just simply that the fish are able to track your bait better because it's slightly clearer. But it was really impressive to me when I would check the deep dive app, which I did every morning when I got up, and I would see, I've seen the transgression over the last 2 weeks of how that lake went from almost entirely mud to the point where you were having very precise clear water areas developing. And now when I checked this morning again, it's almost back to being exactly as muddy as it was 2 weeks ago, because when we had the tournament, it blew like 100 miles an hour, which dirtied it up. Plus, they've had some rain during that time, and the lake is back to being muddy. But it was really important for me to be able to say, hey, this area is clearing up, or this creek is clearing up, because it was that precise. So I think there's some definite value there from a tournament perspective. I do know, I think they don't have that many lakes right now that are under the water clarity perspective, but they're going to be adding more to that. So I'm hoping that they continue to do that, because it really was valuable in this tournament. And if you live in an area that is like Lake Eufaula, that has a lot of mud inflow, and the clear water does usually have better fishing, if you can stay on top of that, it's really valuable. It's an advantage over the competition. So that was important. And then the last thing just had to do with recognizing how windy everything was going to be. There were some anglers that came in late. There were some anglers that broke up things on their boat. And I ended up leaving all 3 days of the tournament. I gave myself an hour and a half to 2 hours to get back, to make sure that I could take my time getting back, to make sure I could get my fish back safely, and to make sure I could check in, because I knew, especially going in on day 2, that I had money in my live wells, meaning you want to make sure you give yourself enough time to get back, to get those fish that are going to be good enough to get you into the pay range on the scales. And I've heard a couple of stories where there were some guys that didn't recognize how windy and how rough it was going to be, and ended up being a little bit late, so they lost poundage because of it. So there's a lot of things that go into tournament fishing. These, I kept it pretty simple, pretty old school, and it panned off pretty well. We go to Lake of the Woods, or Lake of the Ozarks, in about a week. So we kind of have a quick turnaround. But I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully we can keep the ball rolling. Hopefully we can catch another good bag, have another really strong finish. I'll put links to all these baits in the video description if these are something that interests you. Otherwise, guys, thanks again for all the support. Thanks for all the well wishes. It means a lot to me, and hopefully we can keep the ball rolling. So stay tuned. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.